I still remember the sound my truck tires made when I pulled into my driveway that Friday afternoon. That soft crunch over gravel I'd heard thousands of times before, except that day something felt wrong almost immediately. Maybe it was the way the backyard looked strangely open through the side gate. Maybe it was just instinct. But before I'd even killed the engine, my stomach had already started tightening. 3 hours earlier, I'd been wrapping up a construction inspection job 2 counties away, thinking about getting home, grilling a steak, maybe sitting out back with a beer. Instead, I stepped into what looked like the aftermath of a small disaster. My shed was gone. Completely gone. For a second, I genuinely thought I was looking at the wrong property. I stood there blinking like an idiot, trying to process what my eyes were seeing. Where a weathered cedar shed had stood for over 2 decades, there was now nothing but broken boards, twisted hinges, shattered shelves, and piles of debris scattered across the grass. It looked like someone had dropped a bomb in the middle of my yard. I slowly walked toward the wreckage, feeling this strange numbness spreading through my chest. The shed wasn't expensive. It wasn't fancy. Hell, most people probably would have called it old. But that shed mattered to me more than anything else on the property. My father and I built it together when I was 16 years old. Every beam, every nail, every crooked shelf inside had a memory attached to it. My dad had been the kind of man who could fix anything with enough time and determination. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't important. But he taught me how to work with my hands, how to keep my word, and how to stand up for myself when somebody tried pushing me around. After he passed away 8 years earlier, that shed became something more than just a storage building. It was the last physical place that still felt connected to him. His old toolbox was in there. His military service medals. The rocking chair he'd sit in every evening while listening to baseball games on a portable radio. I kept all of it exactly where he'd left it. Or at least I had. My eyes eventually landed on a sheet of white paper taped neatly to my fence. The logo at the top told me everything before I even started reading. Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I ripped it down and scanned the page. Unauthorized structure removed pursuant to community compliance standards. I read it twice, then 3 times. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurd my brain couldn't accept it. Unauthorized structure? That shed had been sitting there before half the neighborhood even existed. Before the HOA was created. Before most of the people currently running it had ever moved into town. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed at the bottom. The woman who answered didn't even let me finish introducing myself. "This is Linda Prescott," she said in a flat voice. "How may I assist you?" Linda Prescott, HOA president, Queen of Maple Ridge. The woman who treated community bylaws like sacred scripture. "You can start by explaining why my shed was demolished while I was out of town." There was a pause. Not a surprised pause. More like a bored pause. Then she sighed. "Mr. Harper, that structure was in violation of multiple aesthetic standards. That structure was on my property. It was lowering neighborhood values. I could feel my blood pressure climbing. You destroyed private property. We corrected a long-standing issue." Corrected. The way she said it made me want to throw my phone across the yard. What happened to everything inside? Another pause. "Any contents were removed during the demolition process." Removed where? I don't have that information. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. "You're going to compensate me for every dollar of damage." That's when she laughed. Actually laughed. "Perhaps you should review the community bylaws before making demands." Then she hung up. Just like that. No apology. No explanation. No concern. That night, I barely slept. I kept walking laps around my backyard, replaying the conversation over and over. Anger would come in waves, then sadness, then anger again. Around midnight, I found myself standing near the rear fence line staring toward the one thing everyone in Maple Ridge seemed to worship more than their own homes. The community pool. It sat beyond a row of decorative hedges, brightly lit even at night, water shimmering under expensive floodlights. Families loved that pool. The HOA advertised it on every brochure. They bragged about it during every community meeting. It was their crown jewel, their pride and joy. And standing there in the dark, looking at that giant pool, I suddenly remembered something my grandfather used to mention years ago whenever the subject of neighborhood development came up. Back then, I'd never paid much attention. But now those old conversations came rushing back with startling clarity. Because according to Grandpa, the land beneath that pool had never actually belonged to the HOA at all. The next morning I skipped breakfast, skipped returning calls from work, and headed straight for the attic. My grandfather had been the kind of man who never threw away paperwork. Tax records, surveys, receipts, handwritten agreements. He kept everything in labeled boxes that looked like they belonged in a museum. For years I joked that someday archaeologists would discover his attic and think they'd found a lost government archive. By noon I was covered in dust and sweat, surrounded by stacks of fading documents, and beginning to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Then I found a yellow folder tucked between property tax records from the 1980s and old insurance paperwork. Written across the front in black marker were 3 words that made my heart skip. South Boundary Survey. I opened it carefully and started reading. The further I got, the harder it became to sit still. There it was. Original property maps dating back nearly 40 years. Survey markers. Legal descriptions. Easement discussions. Notes written by my grandfather himself. And buried inside those records was the exact story he'd tried telling me years earlier. Back in the late 1980s, long before Maple Ridge existed, my family owned a much larger parcel of land. When developers began building the subdivision, they approached my grandfather about using a small section near the rear boundary for recreational facilities. According to the notes, Grandpa had verbally agreed to let them use the space temporarily while ownership details were sorted out later. The paperwork was supposed to follow. It never did. The developers sold the project. Management changed hands. Years passed. The pool got built. New boards took over. People moved away. Eventually, everyone simply assumed the HOA owned the land because the pool had been sitting there for so long. But assumptions aren't deeds. Assumptions aren't legal ownership. Assumptions don't survive county records. I spent the next 2 weeks verifying everything. I hired a surveyor named Rick Talbot, a guy with 30 years of experience and absolutely no patience for HOA nonsense. The first day he walked the property, he looked at the maps, looked at the boundary markers, then looked back at me and said, "You're not going to believe how bad this is. Try me. That pool isn't partially on your land." He pointed toward the fence line. "The entire pool complex is on your land." I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. The pool, the deck, the pump house, the maintenance shed, every square foot sat inside property boundaries that legally belonged to me. A week later, I was sitting inside the county records office listening to a clerk explain that no transfer deed had ever been recorded. No sale, no conveyance, no permanent easement, nothing. Somehow the HOA had spent decades operating a multi-million-dollar community asset on property they didn't legally own. The irony was almost too perfect. The same organization that claimed absolute authority over everyone's property had never bothered to verify ownership of its most valuable facility. Once the survey was certified, my attorney, Daniel Mercer, filed the necessary paperwork. Daniel was one of those lawyers who never raised his voice because he never needed to. The calmer he sounded, the more dangerous he became. After reviewing everything, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "They're in trouble." How much trouble? The kind that keeps board members awake at night. The process took about a month. During that time, Linda Prescott had no idea what was happening. She continued sending compliance notices, continued issuing warnings about landscaping standards, continued acting like she owned the entire neighborhood. One afternoon, I even received a letter threatening fines because some debris from the demolished shed remained visible from the street. I laughed so hard I nearly framed the notice. They destroyed the shed, then threatened to fine me because the wreckage was still there. You couldn't make that up if you tried. Then came the day everything changed. The county finalized the ownership confirmation. Certified documents arrived. Updated records were filed. Every legal question had been answered. The land belonged to me. Officially. Completely. Without dispute. Daniel called that afternoon. "You ready?" "For what?" "For the fun part." The fun part arrived on a blazing Saturday in July. The pool was packed. Kids were jumping off the diving board. Parents were stretched across lounge chairs. Lifeguards were blowing whistles every few minutes. It looked like a commercial for suburban happiness. Around 2 o'clock, I arrived with Daniel, a county enforcement officer, 2 contractors, and several large signs loaded into a trailer. At first, nobody paid much attention. Then the officer stepped forward and requested everyone's attention. The noise gradually died down. Conversations stopped. Children climbed out of the water. A few confused parents stared at us. The officer unfolded a document and began reading. By the time he finished explaining the ownership situation, the entire pool deck had gone silent. One woman actually laughed because she thought it was some kind of joke. It wasn't. The lifeguards received instructions to clear the facility immediately. Parents started gathering towels and bags. Teenagers complained loudly. People demanded explanations. The questions came nonstop. What's happening? How long will this last? Can they do that? The answer was simple. Yes, they could. Or more accurately, I could. Within an hour the pool was empty. By sunset, contractors had installed temporary fencing around every access point. New locks secured every gate. Large signs hung prominently along the perimeter. Private property. No trespassing. Authorized access only. I won't lie. Standing there watching those signs go up felt strangely satisfying. Not because I hated my neighbors. Most of them were decent people. Many had no idea what the HOA had done. But for the first time since returning home and finding my father's shed destroyed, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. The phone calls started before I even got home. Board members, residents, committee chairs, angry parents, confused homeowners. By 9 o'clock that evening my voicemail was full. Then Linda called. I answered immediately. She wasn't calm anymore. What exactly do you think you're doing? She demanded. Protecting my property. That pool serves this entire community. Interesting. That's pretty much what my shed did for me. Her voice sharpened. You cannot hold the neighborhood hostage. Really? I said. Because from where I'm sitting, somebody destroyed private property and ignored ownership rights. Sound familiar? Silence. Then she tried a different approach. Let's be reasonable. I actually laughed. It was the first time she'd used the word reasonable in our entire relationship. Reasonable would have been asking before bulldozing my shed. Mistakes were made. You laughed when I asked for compensation. Another silence. Longer this time. What do you want? There it was. The question she'd been avoiding from the beginning. Not what was fair. Not what was right. What do you want? I looked out my kitchen window toward the darkness beyond the fence line where the pool sat locked and empty. Then I thought about my father's metals. His tools. His chair. All gone because a group of people decided rules mattered more than respect. I want accountability, I said. And until I get it, that pool stays closed. The following weeks turned into absolute chaos. Emergency HOA meetings packed with furious residents. Attorneys sending letters back and forth. Board members scrambling to contain the damage. Every time they threatened legal action, Daniel responded with another stack of documents proving ownership. Every time they argued community necessity, we pointed out their unlawful demolition of private property. The deeper they dug, the worse things became. Then former board members started talking. Old emails surfaced. Internal discussions emerged. Apparently, several people had questioned the shed demolition before it happened. Linda ignored them. One board member even warned that entering private property without permission could expose the HOA to liability. Linda ignored that too. Arrogance has a funny way of becoming evidence once lawyers get involved. By the third week, residents weren't just angry about the pool. They were angry about everything. HOA spending, selective enforcement, questionable decisions. The closed pool became a symbol of years of frustration. And right in the middle of that storm, Linda finally requested a face-to-face meeting. The meeting took place in the clubhouse conference room on a Thursday evening. And for the first time since this entire mess began, Linda Prescott didn't look like the most powerful person in the room. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from realizing a situation you thought you controlled has completely slipped through your fingers. Around her sat 3 board members, 2 attorneys, and several residents who had demanded to be present. Across the table sat Daniel and me. Nobody bothered with small talk. Linda folded her hands and got right to it. What will it take to resolve this? A month earlier that question would have felt like a victory. Now it just felt sad. Because the truth was, there wasn't a number big enough to replace what had been destroyed. You can't assign a dollar value to memories. You can't write a check for time spent building something alongside your father. You certainly can't recover family heirlooms that ended up in a landfill because somebody got drunk on authority. Still, there had to be consequences. Daniel slid a folder across the table. Inside was a complete accounting of damages, legal expenses, property loss, emotional distress claims, and potential liability exposure. The board members flipped through the pages in silence. One of them muttered a curse under his breath. Another simply stared at Linda. Eventually their attorney cleared his throat. We would prefer to settle. I figured you would, I said. Negotiations lasted several hours. Numbers moved back and forth. Lawyers argued. Board members whispered among themselves. Around 10 o'clock that night, an agreement was reached. The HOA would pay $15,000 in compensation, cover all legal costs, issue a formal written acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and permanently remove several enforcement policies that had allowed unauthorized property actions in the first place. For a brief moment, I thought that would be the end of it. Then came the part nobody expected. Linda looked up and said, "If we agree to everything, will you lease the pool property back to the HOA?" The room went quiet. Every person there seemed to hold their breath waiting for my answer. Financially, leasing it back would have been smart. The HOA was prepared to pay a significant annual amount. Residents wanted the facility reopened. Even Daniel had quietly mentioned that it could become a steady source of income. But I kept thinking about the day I came home from that work trip. The empty space where the shed used to stand. The laughter on the phone when I asked for compensation. The assumption that they could simply take what belonged to someone else because they had authority. Finally, I shook my head. No. Linda blinked. No. No lease. One of the board members leaned forward. You're serious? Completely. They stared at me like I had just announced I planned to launch the pool into outer space. Maybe from their perspective I had. The following month became the most talked about period in Maple Ridge history. Contractors arrived. Water trucks pumped thousands of gallons out of the pool. Residents gathered near the fences every day watching the process unfold. Social media groups exploded with arguments. Some people supported me. Some thought I'd gone too far. Others blamed the board entirely. The local newspaper even ran a story about it. By the end of summer, the pool was gone. Not hidden. Not closed temporarily. Gone. The basin was filled with gravel. The deck areas were regraded. The entire property was transformed into a secure storage yard for equipment, trailers, and materials connected to my construction business. Every time somebody drove past expecting to see sparkling blue water, they saw utility trailers parked neatly behind fencing instead. The HOA board elections that fall were brutal. Several members resigned before voting even began. Linda lost her position by a landslide. People who had supported her for years suddenly wanted distance from the controversy. Funny how quickly loyalty disappears when consequences arrive. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. I rebuilt a smaller shed near the original location. It wasn't the same. It never could be. Some things aren't replaceable. But one afternoon while organizing tools inside the new building, I found an old photograph that had somehow survived. It showed 16-year-old me standing beside my father during construction of the original shed. We were both covered in sawdust, both smiling. Looking at that picture, I realized something important. This story had never really been about the building itself. It was about respect, boundaries, accountability. The simple idea that nobody gets to decide your property rights disappear just because they hold a title or sit on a board. Sometimes people become so comfortable with authority that they forget it has limits. And sometimes those limits are written in county records waiting quietly for someone to notice them. Every now and then a former neighbor still asks whether I regret what happened to the pool. Honestly, I don't have a simple answer. Part of me wishes none of it had happened. I wish the shed was still standing. I wish the board had chosen a phone call instead of a bulldozer. I wish common sense had shown up before lawyers became necessary. But another part of me believes that actions have consequences. And if nobody ever faces those consequences, the behavior never changes. The people running that HOA thought they were untouchable. They thought rules applied to everyone except themselves. In the end, they learned the same lesson my father taught me when I was a kid working beside him with a hammer in my hand. If you take something that doesn't belong to you, eventually the bill comes due. So now I want to hear from you. Did I go too far by refusing to lease the property back and turning the pool into a storage yard? Or was it exactly the consequence the HOA earned after destroying private property without permission? If you were in my position, would you have reopened the pool for the neighborhood, or would you have done the same thing I did? Let me know down in the comments, because this is one of those stories where people seem to split right down the middle. And if you enjoy real stories about property disputes, HOA drama, and ordinary people standing up for themselves when powerful organizations cross the line, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even crazier than this one.